Hey everybody, back with you again here at the Workbench. If you saw the last video, you heard some audio from June 6, 1944, that were the initial reports of the D-Day invasion in Normandy, France, as well as some big band music from the era, all heard through a vintage vacuum tube radio, and you can see the vacuum tubes back there. Maybe you can even see them glowing a little bit. And the other components, which represent the height of radio technology of the day. This radio happens to be a Wilcox Gay Model 6A-C5 from 1939, and so entirely probable that people were listening to those same radio broadcasts on this sort of radio. The good news is that radios like this are still available today. You can find them all over eBay, on Craigslist. There are other online sellers. And the good news is that there are also plenty of radio shops who will work on this for you and get them back into operation for not a whole lot of money, which is great news. I think majority of people like using these to play vintage music through their vintage radio. But there are some things that you need to know about it, some little problems, but luckily they can easily be overcome. Starting with the radio frequencies that are available. Obviously, back in the day, there was no FM radio. It was AM and shortwave. You can see the AM scale on this radio goes from 500 kilocycles to 1550 kilocycles, today known as kilohertz. And most radios of the time also came with a shortwave band, just like this one. You can see in the green scale that goes from 1.0 to 5.0 megacycles, today known as megahertz. At the time, the shortwave band was mostly used for international broadcasting, as well as it was used by police for their internal communications. Over the years, police found other frequencies, other capabilities to use, and AM broadcast was really popular. I mean, for many years, that was the only way you were hearing any radio. There was no FM, like I said. So the AM band was eventually extended through the 1600 kilocycles and eventually to where it is today, which I believe is at 1710 kilocycles or kilohertz. On this radio, that would be 1.7 megacycles on the green or shortwave scale. Hope that's not too confusing. But anyway, if you've ever scrolled around on the AM band, you'll find that there's really not much more than religious broadcasting, sports broadcasting, and a whole heck of a lot of radio talk, which I think we could do without. And so for most people who buy these radios, they want to hear vintage music through their vintage radio, which totally makes sense. Luckily, there are a few solutions to that. Some of the more popular ones are that people will splice Bluetooth modules or stereo jacks into the circuitry of the radio, which is fine. They work very well, but you are fiddling with the original circuitry of the radio. And for those who are purists, you're not actually transmitting your music through the AM radio waves as was originally intended. So for those of us who would prefer that and would prefer to make life a little more frustrating and difficult for ourselves, that's what we try to do. And the good news is that, yes, you can do it, but the FCC tightly controls and regulates AM radio transmitters. You have to comply with FCC regulation. I think it's Part 15, which basically states that you have to have a transmitter that operates below 100 milliwatts. So these are low power transmitters, and you can find them as well for sale, but they tend to be a little bit pricey. So luckily there are a few other cheap and easy options out there, especially for those of us who may not be all that technically savvy with radio equipment. And I'm going to show you probably the cheapest and easiest way to do that today, which is really buy this toy that came out in the early 2000s called the Radio DJ Real Broadcast Studio by a company called Wild Planet. And basically it allowed you to transmit on one frequency, which was 1610 kilohertz, which again on this radio would be 1.61 megacycles or megahertz. And you could actually play a cassette tape, you could talk through a microphone, you could plug in an external device, which at the time was probably a CD player, their sound effects. So it's kind of a fun little thing at the time. Kids probably don't really even care about this stuff today, but you could transmit whatever you were playing here across the AM radio waves and receive that on your radio on 1610 kilohertz, which is pretty cool. But obviously, like I said, these probably aren't in use much today by kids, but folks who are into vintage radio and who do want a cheap and easy way to transmit their era music across the radio waves can use this to actually accomplish that, which is a great thing. And so the way you do it is super, super simple. Right now I actually have this horrible, god-awful green iPhone that I had from way back. But you can still connect it to the internet through Wi-Fi, and you can still get on YouTube. You can compile some music lists for free. There's also some live streaming 1940s era radio. There's a website I know of called 1940sradio.com that is live streaming era music from the UK live, which is pretty cool. And anyway, through your stereo jack into this toy transmitter here, and then out the antenna, which I just happen to run up the wall here for convenience sake, and then received by your radio's antenna, which in this case is on the left side, the black wire that goes to your vintage radio, which is pretty cool. So I actually already have the radio on, you can see, because it's lit up. For those who aren't aware, vacuum tubes do take some time to warm up. If they're not warmed up, you're not going to get very good reception. You're not going to get very good volume. So it takes them about a minute or so for the tubes to warm up, and then you'll be listening to your radio like normal. So I already have music playing through my YouTube playlist here on my iPhone. I actually already have the transmitter on. A couple things to note here is that any transmission out of this particular transmitter will get distorted if you crank it up all the way. So it's best to keep it at about half, or maybe a little bit more than half, so it doesn't sound distorted in your radio. What I do is I crank up the iPhone all the way. As I said, keep this at about half or a little bit more, and then just adjust your volume on your radio like you normally would. And that's basically it. Another thing I did to this particular unit is I disconnected the on-air light because this is battery powered, and I didn't want to waste the battery juice on a light that I don't really care about. I'd like to just keep the radio transmission going on as long as I possibly can. So I disconnected that internally and capped off those ends. You can keep it on if you want, but again, it just is an unnecessary drain on your battery. You can already start hearing the music coming through. So with that, I'll just kind of turn on the radio volume here a little bit more so you can see what it sounds like. So that's basically it. You can find these radio DJ toys on eBay or Craigslist or other places for 20 or 30 bucks. If you can get one for under 20, you're doing really well. And they're really easy to use. For those who are a little more technically savvy, you could even modify them a little bit more so they have a little more output. I believe this operates at about 50 milliwatts, so you still have some room to play with there to keep it legal if you wanted to increase the power a little bit. I've not done that. One other thing to note is you'll notice that I do have the transmitter antenna and the radio antenna close together. I just did that for illustrative purposes. You can spread them much farther apart, but again, it depends on a lot of things. AM radio transmission is dependent or affected by a lot of things, including environmentals and a lot of modern day appliances that weren't around back then, including fluorescent lights and especially plasma televisions, among many other things in your household. And they can really affect the reception on your radio too. So that's just something to note. But to review, output device into the toy transmitter for $20, and then into your vintage radio. That's about it. It's really that simple. Anybody can do it. It's a lot of fun, and it's great listening to this old music through your old radios. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please let me know, and stay safe out there.